We want to talk about the role of global investigative journalism. And maybe some of you have been to the session of last night where Deutsche Welle presented the Freedom of Speech Award to my wonderful colleague Annabel Hernandez, and she was talking about the importance of global investigative journalism in a very emotional speech. Maybe some of you have seen it. We would like to give you a small follow-up on this idea. I have here on the panel my wonderful guest, Professor Janine Wedel, who is currently working and living in Stockholm in Sweden. However, she is a professor at George Mason University for policy and government. She's visiting Europe because part of herself is European, I could say so, because she spent a lot of time during Europe's most emotional period of our latest history, end of the 1980s and 1990s. You were based in Poland, and you were very close to the events back then and the beginning of the protests of Solidarność. You met Lech Walesa, for example, at the time, and you met him later, as I heard yesterday, again, and you still have an strong emotional connection to Europe. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for being here, Janine.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Good. On my left, my colleague Ilya Lozovsky. He was also a Cold War story in his biography. He was born in Moscow, but then his family moved to the greater Boston area where you grew up. You're American, but probably that personal history somehow plays a role concerning the reason why you are living in Europe now today as well, right? Absolutely. He's working for the OCCRP, which is the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. They are based in Sarajevo, but Ilya just told me, please make sure as well that this is not a Balkan organization or whatsoever, but an international platform for investigative journalism that is based in Sarajevo, like some other international institutions nowadays. Ilya has a strong record in publications, in journalism, writing for Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Haaretz, and many other outstanding publications. Thank you so much for being here, Ilya.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Good. My name is Frank Hofmann. I work as a senior correspondent for Deutsche Welle for a period of time now, and I'm very happy to welcome you here. Thanks so much for your interest in investigative journalism. And I would like to start with Janine here, helping you a little bit the idea what global investigative journalism can bring out. Some of you might have heard about the Panama-Papers, for example, 2-3 years ago, that are still very important when it comes to research on national levels and in different countries worldwide, not only here in Europe. And Janine is not directly connected to the Panama Papers, but Janine brought up a model, an academic model, that helps us to understand what stands behind what we read here in the newspapers and what journalists brought up when it comes, for example, to the Panama Papers. I would like to give you the floor, Janine, and explain us a little bit your model of how you called it shadow elites.
Right. So shadow elites, and I expect that many of you in journalism have encountered some of these players in the issues that you study. But these are players who have arisen in the past several decades during the period of great increased privatization and deregulation in the 80s, followed by the end of the Cold War, great financialization that gives finance an outsized role in the economy, and of course digitization, which changes everything, most importantly, or very importantly, the media. So these players have arisen because of these developments, which have given us many more spaces for policy and governance, many more spaces for private people to play roles that affect public policy, and roles and with agendas that are their own or their networks. So they may be working for a government agency and a think tank at the same time, for instance, but they have their own private agenda that is at stake. So for instance, it's the retired general who sits on a government advisory board and has access to inside information and access, while at the same time he has his own consulting firm that does business only with the government, and he can shape the government's agenda while he's sitting on that board, and of course he can use that to his own advantage in his firm. So we, the public, don't know whether he's operating in his own interest or in the national interest. And additionally, if he really wants to build his brand, he wants to have a media role, be on CNN, for instance. And for that, he needs a neutral imprimatur. So he's going to want to have a university or a think tank role. So shadow elites assume a tangle of roles across state and private roles, and also in think tanks, grassroots organizations, and so on. And they use information that they get in official roles for their own private agendas. And we, the public, don't know what is that retired general, whose interest is he really acting on, in whose interest is he acting when he's making decisions. So I call this representational juggling, to provide a completely different example of representational juggling. So it could be the former Homeland Security minister who represents a notorious Ukrainian oligarch who is embedded with Russian organized crime, so embedded that he had to flee during the last election. And at the same time that Mr. Homeland Security appears in the media and represents this organized crime affiliated person, he's also the chair of an NGO that you probably have heard of called Freedom House. He's the board chair of Freedom House, right? So what's going on there?
We are journalists. I think we can drop names here. I mean, you're talking about Mr. Firtash, a Ukrainian oligarch.
And this is Michael Chertoff, the former Homeland Security chief.
And Mr. Firtash, an oligarch from Ukraine who had to leave the country in the course of Euromaidan a couple of years ago.
Exactly. Thank you. Or to take the example of a consulting firm with global reach all over the world. It represents the big banks. It's made up of former regulators. But at the same time that it represents big banks, gets inside information from inside government, can lobby informally and so on. At the same time, it's also given regulatory authority by the government to do, guess what? Regulate those same banks, right? So these players fuse state and private power, and they assume a tangle of roles. They engage in representational juggling. Their corruption, if you want to call it that, is legal, and it is systemic. You find these players across the board, from finance to health policy to social policy. They're in just about every arena, and many countries, the United States and Western democracies where I've charted them, but certainly people from Africa, Latin America, et cetera, have come to me with very similar examples. And just one other quick thing, they often work together in interlocking networks. So the same group of people keeps coming up in different incarnations to achieve their private agendas. So if Elia is manager of the board of one company, then Frank will be his deputy, and I'll be the secretary. The next organization, I'll be the president, vice president. So the same group of people coming up in different incarnations with roles in consultancies and government and media, working towards our private agendas, their private agendas.
How do they meet in the shadow? I mean, the London clubs would have been an example for that,
Right.
but I think they are an example of the past.
Well, yes. So this is a new way of operating. It's no longer the revolving door where people have been in government and then they just go to another a private entity. This they come out of very often official positions, but they go to 4 or 5. They go to 4 or 5 roles which they maintain simultaneously. So a think tank role, a consultancy, and it's not clear where one role begins and the other role ends. And some of their activities are in the shadows, right? But many of them are public. They're out there in the public domain. We know who they are. Many of them, some of them we don't know who they are, but it's definitely not a conspiracy. This is not a conspiracy, and I've spent many years of my life as a social anthropologist charting the activities of these kinds of players and documenting that they exist in lots of different domains and have been very important in shaping some of the most important public policy decisions in our lifetimes.
Before we move over to Ilia, maybe you can give us 2 or 3 more examples to make it a little bit more colorful.
Oh, well.
Or I can ask you maybe. Is it that there's a public meeting or people meeting in the public because they are board members of a company or of a consulting group or whatsoever, and then in the evening they meet in the golf club and other people are joining and then they exchange certain interests?
The thing about these groups is you can't reduce them to lobbying groups. There's not formally lobbyists, and they often have people on the inside, right? Lobbyists come from the outside. They have some of their people on the inside of official structures, right? And then other people in other organizations like think tanks, and you can't reduce them to being lobbyists or clubs or political parties. They're elements of all of those things. So for instance, the United States decision to go to war in Iraq in the early 2000s, there was a very small group of players that I call the neocon core that had been working together and actually changing structures, changing the way in which governance operated in the United States since the late 1970s. The same group of players, but it's not a conspiracy. Much of what they've done has been in the open. And some has been a little bit more behind the scenes. But they helped take the United States to war in Iraq, and they did things like when the official intelligence of the United States, official intelligence bodies were not saying that there was a connection between Saddam Hussein and the terrorist attacks of 9/11, then the neocon core, with people, some officials in government, established, they had some officials in government, established additional centers in the intelligence bodies. So in the Pentagon, and these units that they established, they manned with their own people from think tanks that they had set up that were all populated by them, think tanks that had been set up, some of them, as much as 10 years earlier, for that precise reason, to get rid of Saddam Hussein and change U.S. policy in the Middle East by first getting rid of Saddam Hussein. And then those units came up with intelligence, so-called, that there was a connection between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein. And then that, of course, was that then gained an official imprimatur, an official seal, even though those analysis were not made by the CIA or the traditional structures of the Pentagon. So that's one part of one example, because there are lots of ways in which they changed governance in order to make these changes. And it's important that we look at the structures, we look at the ecosystem in which these players are operating in today, not just the players themselves and the personalities, because they come out of the ecostructure, the ecosystem.
So you're saying the war in Iraq was a political example, but there are also economical examples. You're saying that the same level of structures or the same shadow elite structures, they produce corruption and they bring people together and are responsible for money laundering, for example, right?
Well, so what we've seen since the end of the Cold War, of course, is and Ilya can certainly speak to this, is the development of industries, of enablers, right? Because first we had the privatizations in Russia and other former Soviet countries that privatized the industries and such, and that's where we got the development. Economies. Right, this formerly state-owned communist industries. And that's how we got the oligarchs, of course, and the kleptocrats. And kleptocrats need help in offshoring. They can't steal on their own and offshore it. So a whole industry of enablers, of tax accountants, lawyers, and so on, developed around this. And this is another part of this, the new spaces that have been created for public policy and governance since the end of the Cold War.
Thank you very much, Janine, for these insights. Ilya, would you agree that there's a universal pattern, that there's that you can describe this as a structural phenomenon like Janine just said, according to your practical work? You're doing research, you bring A and B together, 2 and 2, and you get 4, and you get a bigger picture. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. There's always going to be certain specifics, regional specifics, country specifics that are different. But I think it's really important, the point Janine made about it being an ecosystem and the structure. This is, as investigative journalists, this is what I'm proudest of in our work, when we can expose not just the specific people or personalities that are doing this, but really get behind the scenes and look at the international structures they're using. In our work, we focus a lot on, the former communist world, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, as well as now more recently Latin America and Africa and other places. But in all of these places, the oligarchs, the former ministers, all these corrupt officials, after they steal all their money, they want to put it somewhere safe because they don't want the same thing to happen to them. They don't want the money taken from them. And one of the things that we focus on most is showing how they use the international financial system to take the money that they've stolen from their own people in many cases and bring it to the West and park it somewhere in London real estate or Miami or New York.
And how does it work?
Well, this is actually, so a little Google tip. If you Google OCCRP, my organization, and laundromat, you will find several separate, very in-depth investigations on exactly the mechanisms that allow this to happen. This is part of the challenge of our work, is making this kind of investigation interesting to read, because it's very forensic and it's very complicated, and we try not to focus on personalities that much. But we show how they set up entire networks of offshore companies. Sometimes, in a recent example, what we call the Troika laundromat, 70 plus offshore companies with bank accounts all in one bank in the Baltics, receiving money from Russia from various sources, known and unknown, slicing and dicing it, sending dozens of transactions a day, chopping the money up into different tranches, sending it around, and then it rockets out of the system at the other end and ends up in Spanish properties on the beach, or office space in London or Miami. And in this way, we call it this industry Janine was talking about. We call it the criminal services industry, because it allows not only corrupt officials, but actual organized crime figures, sometimes they're the same people, to take illicitly gotten money, chop it up, obscure its origins completely, and with the complicity of the entire world financial system, including any banks where we all have our personal bank accounts, it ends up in the West. One of my favorite examples is Deutsche Bank had an internal document where they said that they didn't realize the extent of their own money laundering occurring in their own system until OCCRP reported on it.
Why are these... Go on. Thank you very much. Thanks for your applause. Why is that money being sliced, as you just said it?
Well, the purpose is to obscure the origin. We can't show in every case. We're very, very scrupulous about what we can prove and what we cannot prove. We ride on our credibility. So when we don't know something, we say we don't know it. So for a scheme like the Troika Laundromat, which in total was over $4 billion in transactions, a large majority of that money, we don't know where it came from, and sometimes we don't know where it went, and we say that up front in our stories. But if you look at the stories, we have specific sections where we show specific schemes where criminal schemes, actually, where that money came from, which makes it money laundering. One example probably most people are familiar with is the Magnitsky scandal in Russia, where hundreds of millions of dollars were stolen from the tax authorities. The lawyer who exposed it died in prison after being ill-treated. Some of the same companies involved in passing around that money were also involved in the Troika Laundromat. Then there's a whole separate laundromat, the Azerbaijani laundromat, which we show was used by Azerbaijani elites to send money, and in some cases to bribe officials with the Council of Europe, who then observed elections in Azerbaijan and said, this election corresponds to all the standards that we are, testing them against, which if anyone knows the slightest bit about Azerbaijan, it is one of the most repressive and undemocratic places in the world. One of our reporters, Khadija Ismailova, was famously imprisoned in Azerbaijan for a long time, and we can't, in many cases, our colleagues there can't publish anything under their names ever. And these European politicians from countries like Germany, from countries like Italy, receive money from these mysterious accounts. This is what we're talking about. Shadow elites is dark money, and dark money is dark power. And they whitewash the reputation of these bloody regimes, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to call it that. And I'm not remembering now what the question was, but sometimes it gets a little heated.
Maybe we could stick with that. There's,
sure.
When it comes to the Panama Papers, we found out that there was a whole system coming from, to bring up the example of Ukraine, to have one country that is suffering oligarchism a lot, maybe most of all post-Soviet countries. Bank accounts in Cyprus were very important for the system. But then again in Panama was the organizational agency, the consultancy bureau that did all this. How does that work?
So if you're trying to channel $20 billion out of Ukraine, for example, or let's say, okay, let's pick a specific example, $5 billion from Privatbank, once Ukraine's largest private bank, from which over $5 billion were stolen by Bogolyubov and Kolomoisky, two famous Ukrainian oligarchs, one of whom has recently returned to the country after the recent election.
Just 2 weeks ago, yeah.
If you're channeling that amount of money, you can't just write yourself a check or wire it. You know, there are some controls in place that prevent you from doing that. That's why these constellations of offshore companies exist. You can send it from one to the other. It'll be 10 different transactions. The money will be split 100 different ways. All of these companies are operated on paper by proxies, not the real people who are really benefiting from the system. But in one case, we found seasonal laborers from Armenia who go to Moscow to work on construction sites and live, in very humble places. And their names are on the documents. Their signatures are on the documents. And we can't always establish the mechanism through which their identity was stolen, but the contrast is just so striking. So you need actors who will set those things up for you. So famously, the offshore services provider that was behind Panama Papers was Mossack Fonseca. There's another one. The name is escaping me at the moment. Appleby, that was behind the Paradise Papers leaks. And in the latest Troika Laundromat, there was a company based in Ireland and Latvia, I believe, that was setting up these companies. So you need professionals, lawyers, accountants, all kinds of people who will set up this infrastructure for you, and they get good money for it, and they're not ashamed of what they do, and you see this all over the world. And in some cases, that's how we track them down, because we find the same accountant's name on 200 different companies participating in a dozen different schemes used by all these different oligarchs. And to get back to the Ukraine example with the $5 billion from Privatbank, we recently published a story that sort of forensically explored what is the mechanism by which $5 billion was taken out of Privatbank. And it turns out what they did is the Privatbank established a branch in Cyprus that was treated as a domestic branch of Privatbank. So the same controls that would normally be applied to billions of dollars sent to a foreign bank did not apply in this case. The money went to Cyprus. Again, it's much more complicated than I'm saying right now. If you read the story, there's slicing and dicing and fake loans and all kinds of stuff. But in the end, once it's outside of Ukraine, once it's in the EU, then off you go. And the next thing you know, you have an empty apartment in New York that's worth millions of dollars. That's where you park your money.
I would like to come overseas. Annabelle Hernandez just last night, who received the Free Speech Award of Deutsche Welle yesterday, she showed a map showing the whole world with Mexico on the one side and black countries that have a connection to the drug cartel or to drug cartels, like the United States, like Russia, like so many other countries. In the case of Mexico and drug trafficking, where would you start there?
Where would you start looking into it?
Yes.
I mean, I think, so we haven't done a lot of work on Mexico yet, although
no, but
we will get there.
If you would start now, you have a project coming up and you would say, hey, Annabelle is right, we should take care about this more precisely and more with an in-depth research. Where would you start?
Well, you're probably going to need some kind of leak. You're going to need some kind of banking record leak or some other documents that are going to come out from a whistleblower or some other method where you can see the actual transactions and then piece it together. You would look at where the money was coming from, where it was going. You would look into the companies that were setting up the offshores. And it's interesting that you mentioned drugs, because sort of the more since I've come to work at OCCRP just over 2 years ago, the longer I'm there, the more I think to myself, I need to start thinking less about ideology and just more about the money. And I know it sounds cynical, but anytime you look at any extremist organization, whether it's the FARC, former FARC guerrillas in Latin America, or whether it's Hezbollah, or whether it's far-right populists in Europe or even in the US, scratch them a little bit beneath the ideology. You'll always find criminality, you'll always find drug money. This is one of the primary vehicles, so it's really a great point to highlight, and these are investigations that need to keep happening. I think Janine has a comment.
So I would just say that in my work, money can be important, but, and following the money, of course, brings us to very, very crucial issues, as Ilya has been talking about. But I follow the players. And that, too, because the same players often keep coming up in different incarnations, the same networks of close-knit networks of people. I'll bet that some of you have seen this in your own country. So where are the players going, and what are they doing? What are their activities, and how might they be working together and using official information in their for their own private capacities? And some of their activity is driven by making money, but some of it is driven by ideology and maybe a little money on the side. There's a lot of activity that I find that's driven by ideology. And I was wondering whether another point as to your question that Ilya was answering just a minute ago would be to look for those legitimate players who are helping the drug cartels launder the money. That there's part of this post-Cold War story that is illicit, but there's a huge part of it that is not illicit. That is people in the shadow elite model fusing state and private power by assuming a tangle tangle of roles, and also involved in this enabler industry, which Ilya called, what did you call it?
Criminal services.
Criminal services. But these are people who are not engaged in illegal activity. And I think you had said earlier that you can often find clues by looking at some of those folks.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah?
sorry, just to respond, in I would say a majority of cases, we're not always going to show that something illegal has occurred because nothing illegal has occurred. This is part of this. We're pointing to the system that is legally and completely, almost by design, enabling this kind of behavior.
And this is a lot of this is what has been called legal corruption, which is systemic, and I would call it some of this behavior, at least corruption, because it violates the public trust. And that goes back to a very old definition of corruption that we find in the Bible, we find in Islamic
Talk about morality
text.
at this
Yeah,
point,
that.
Janine, do you really think that? Do you think that journalists are really the ones that can play the role of an antidote to this development? That the good guys can be the bad guys in the same time, and they are of public investigation.
Well, obviously, the journalists are operating in a much larger ecosystem that has been changing by the second. And we have to understand it that way. Journalism, as you know, has been gutted in the past several decades. There's a whole new ecosystem of social media and smartphones, and most people get their information from their smartphone. Or developed countries, maybe I should say. So we have to understand that it's a much broader societal problem that we're facing here. And part of this has to do with the collapse of trust that people have in institutions, all manner of institutions, including the media. Trust in the media has plummeted, right? But who do people trust? People trust their friends, and for all practical purposes, sometimes people's Facebook friends, so-called, are their editors. That's what people read. So Facebook friends are your de facto editors. So I think journalists play a crucial role, but journalists alone, it needs to be seen as a much broader problem. Investigative journalists in particular, I think, can play a huge role.
Whereas Facebook, for example, is also a platform for a lot of manipulation when it comes to maybe Russian interests, for example.
Well, absolutely, the trolls and the bots and so on. So this is a real problem of our age that needs to be dealt with by society.
Okay, Ilya, what has changed here? You're working for an investigative platform. I do work for DW Deutsche Welle, an organization that was founded back in the 1950s. The BBC has a name, the New York Times has a name. How important is it for you to collaborate with us, representing such organizations, or do you think that our time is over?
There's an old quote, it's amazing what you can get done when you don't care who gets the credit. So at OCCRP, I think one of our very, very basic fundamental philosophies is that without collaboration across borders, we're not going to catch these people. We, investigative journalists that can work across borders, are in some ways the only natural enemy of these shadow elites whose money crosses borders, whose yachts, who can buy visas for themselves with their money. You can't, any strictly locally based organization by itself, with the best will in the world, with all the money in the world even, which is of course not going to be the case anyway, they can't do both ends. So that's why we are a network. Our home base is in Sarajevo. We have about 40, 50 people there, including that's why we call ourselves a platform. We have a data team that helps with data analysis. We have a research team. We have a tech team. We have a team that helps all our member centers with security. But the real heart of the organization, in some ways, are our member centers who are all over the place in Belgrade, in Kiev, in Moscow.
How do you approach people you would like to collaborate with, you work with? If somebody here in the room would like to get in touch with you because he has an idea and he needs help for...
We will collaborate with anyone who is independent and who can show themselves to do good work. We've, just in my short time at OCCRP, we've expanded our network by a whole lot. And some of our best work we've done has been because of the regional centers. I mean, without them, it really wouldn't be possible. So I think that to meet the challenge of this new globalized world, journalism has to be globalized too. Investigative journalism has to be globalized. And that's what we're working on. And I think we have to start seeing journalism as a public good. This is not going to be captured by the market. This is not a money-making proposition. Society needs to realize, citizens need to realize that just like you pay for police and you pay for fire and you pay for roads, you have to pay for independent, rigorous, investigative journalism. And one more thing I would say that I think needs to change, and I think it's starting already, and even some of my close colleagues might disagree with me to some extent. I think journalists, while maintaining their impartiality and continuing to earn and deserve public trust, we have to be honest about where we're coming from. We are not neutral. You know, at OCCRP, I am completely comfortable saying we are against corruption. We are not going to pretend that every side has, two sides are always equal, or that we are acting in the public interest. That's how we justify, the grants that we receive and the trust that our readers have in us. And we need to be upfront and open about that. I think that's part of earning the trust of our readers, is being very forthright about where we're coming from. And just one concrete example of that, I think this is maybe not unique, or maybe it is unique, but certainly it's new and unusual. We have a formal partnership with Transparency International. It's called the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium. The whole idea is that we remain in our journalistic mode without becoming activists, without becoming something that we're not. But we collaborate with them on our investigations to sort of hand off some of the data, to hand off the work we've done, to collaborate behind the scenes, and then to allow them to take it forward after we've published, to make sure our investigations reach the policymakers, reach the opinion leaders, reach the activist networks that they have all over the world too. And it's a super challenging thing to do. It's a logistical nightmare. But even, being a network that is all over the world is already a logistical nightmare. These are super challenging things to do, but we do it because we believe it's the only way to do it. And I think that really amplifies the impact that our journalism has. And that's how we forthrightly, and honestly say, yes, we are against corruption. Yes, we're going to fight these shadow elites. But you can... we are very forthright about that, and where we're funded. It's all on our site, and it's all in our annual reports, so we don't hide anything about ourselves. So, and we show the work, we show the proof, and we allow our readers to drill down and to look at the documents themselves in many cases.
I'm sure that most of our colleagues here have an anti-corruption agenda, so I think that's a good moment to open the floor. Do you have any questions to our two panelists here? You have more the academic side and the model of shadow elites. Janine was just elaborating, and some insights, wonderful insights from Ilias' work for the OCC RP. Some questions. I take you right away. First, ladies first, and then you. And then over there, I see you, and over there. Yeah? Let's take three, and maybe then we do a second round first.
Hi, my name is Dagmar Kasp. I'm from the Czech Republic, and I would like to ask, what you have described the system and how it works, and the system and how you discover and investigate these things. It's all very, very interesting and inspiring. But what I see in our country is that erosion of trust in everything and in the public authorities, press, and everything has been abused by, let's say, very particularly our prime minister. And, people, because they don't know what to trust, they actually, to be frank, I'll be a devil's advocate, they don't really care about all of this. So not all of them, but but some of them, we see it in our election results, we see in the discourse on social media. So would you be able to maybe point us in a direction and say how to bridge this? You know, it's all very well to know the background, but how to make people care, why should they care? If you could elaborate on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's collect two more questions first before you answer.
Right. I'm from Pakistan, and we started with Panama Papers. Panama Papers have really wrecked our entire political system. What I was thinking is that you mentioned about the coterie that that brought about the move for a war against Iraq. Is the same coterie working now for war against Iran? And what your organization or whatever your efforts are being done to expose them so that these people would know which direction they are leading the country to and the world to this abysmal situation?
Okay, thank you. And then we had one more over there.
Thank you very much. The first one is related to what my colleague asked the first question. And I just wanted to add that maybe if you could really emphasize, I come from Malawi, and more generally speaking in Africa, journalists will expose corruption all the time. But as she said, we always see it, they always get re-elected. And just if you could speak to that. And secondly, from the award ceremony yesterday, we saw how journalists are under threat. And today in one of the panel discussions, there was also a discussion on how, even in Europe, journalists are now under threat. They're being attacked and threatened and all that. I just wanted you to share your experience, if these are the things that you also encounter after you expose these kind of stories. And just finally, I think coming from Africa as well, one of the things that kind of draw us back as journalists is the fact that one is the issue to do with resources, and sometimes the collaborations are really difficult in our scenario. I just wanted you to also share what would be your experience, or what would you share as advice so that we do more on collaborations, because we honestly see it that one politician in one country would really work together with another one, and there is that connection. Thanks.
Thank you very much. For now, I would like to give Ilya right away. The question is, how can you regain trust in the public in a situation where, in the Czech Republic, Mr. Babiš, who is a media owner himself, by the way,
about being transparent about our own motivations. I think we have to, it's about good journalistic craft, through the human stories, showing who the victims are in any given scenario. But there's a lot of noise and trolls out there, and if you're a regular citizen, I think the problem is it just makes you cynical, and that's the enemies of democracy, the enemies of free press. They know this very well. That's why they throw 100 different bullshit theories out there until you can't tell the one true one anymore. It's hard to say what to do. I mean, we have to do the best work we can. I think at OCCRP, we never rely on anonymous sources. We always have documentation that proves what we're proving. We're careful and conservative about not making any claims we can't back up. That's just standard journalistic craft that I think any of us should be aiming for, but it's not going to solve the problem by itself. I think we have to focus on solutions journalism sometimes. I think we have to show what is going right in the world once in a while, highlight the actors that are making a difference.
Constructive journalism.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And also there is a sort of a movement, I don't know if you could call it one movement, but there's a tendency, I guess, of various, especially nonprofit journalistic organizations working to establish not subscriber bases, but membership bases. Having people who feel invested in what the outlet is doing, not just asking them for money so they can read our content, but asking them to contribute, drawing on them for expertise, collaborating with them in some way. And there's 100 different models of how this is possible to do. And we're still, I think, in the very early stages. But nonprofit journalism is a hugely growing field, fortunately. And I think, all I can say is I hope that is at least we are groping towards some kind of answer. But I think also we have to hold accountable the Facebook and the Twitter and the Instagram and everyone else who is poisoning the environment and who is making it very hard for ordinary people to distinguish between, lies and the truth.
Maybe just very briefly, I'm a journalist in Malawi. I don't have a lot of resources I can rely on, but I still have this idea, and I have an idea of a connection maybe to Europe or elsewhere in the world. What would be your practical advice for my colleague over here?
As far as the lack of resources, I think there should be a realization that there's a lot of interest and many donors in journalism in Africa and Latin America and many other places that traditionally have not received as much attention. So I think actively looking for those sources of just purely financing so you can survive and showing that you're ready to collaborate with your colleagues across the continent in other countries. Again, if there was an easy answer to this question, somebody would have thought of it already, but there is help out there. We've hired 2 regional editors in South Africa just in the last year or 2, and we did a big investigation recently in the Gambia. We've done a lot on the Gupta family in South Africa. So just as an organization that was based initially just in Europe, we've expanded, and we've found a lot of enthusiasm among donors and grant givers to expand towards Africa. So don't give up and keep looking and asking and demanding the help that you deserve. And I think you will get it.
Thank you very much. Janine, maybe this question from my colleague from Pakistan to you. As far as I understood, you mean that people were exposed, but the same people are doing the same, and the whole structure is ongoing and lifelong.
So yes, I haven't had a chance to fully investigate it, but it does look to me like it is many of the same few people who are agitating to take the United States to war in Iran, using exactly the same kinds of techniques as before, creating intelligence that so-called, in quotes, that gains an official imprimatur intelligence that the other intelligence services won't come up with, using this network of think tanks that they set up to create, or letterhead organizations, as they're sometimes called, to look like there's a big public outcry, this kind of thing. Same players, same technique, so it's very, very worrisome indeed. Could I just go back to the previous question? Yeah. So just in building on what Ilya's very important points, I would say that people do care about elite corruption, and that's how we got to where we are. That people have been, are a big reason that we have these anti-system, sometimes called populist movements around the world, and people are looking to alternative leaders because they were pissed off about those elites and what they are up to. Now, the problem, of course, is that when these leaders come to power, autocratic leaders, they create much more corruption of many different forms, and not just shadow elite kind of corruption than we had before. But I think people do care, and there is, and part of the issue here is that societies are so polarized. We all know that, and so, and I'm just throwing this out as a potential idea for discussion, maybe. But is it possible as journalists to even create outreach with people that we don't normally perhaps come into contact with or talk with? So if we're based in of course we don't have time, journalists don't have time to do this, but I mean, if we're based in a capital city and we're seen as the part of the elite and such, is it possible to actually establish real relationships with communities that would perhaps never read our stuff if they didn't know us personally? That's perhaps just a...
Yeah.
Let me say something that goes to another question that was asked. And
could you answer that one? Do you want to answer that one? Yeah.
Yes, outreach completely. I mean, I think I was heading in that direction with the comment about membership. I think involving readers, that they're not just passive recipients of whatever we shovel at them, but that they're almost, in some sense, participating in what we're doing. We're all getting at the truth together. You know, some of the most powerful words in journalism are "help us investigate," and that's where we can earn trust, because the readers, members see, not just readers, members see that they are participating in joint mission of establishing the truth together and cutting through the lies. And just to come back 1 second, I think this is a connected point about cynicism. I mean, one of the greatest sort of, and also about threats against journalism. One of, unfortunately, a young Slovak journalist was killed last year, Jan Kuciak, and his fiance, while working on a story with us. And that led to a huge popular uprising in Slovakia. People still care. When a young journalist is murdered in cold blood because he was trying to find out the truth, that will still get through to people. We publish, and our policy, whenever that happens, that's not the only time we've been threatened or that something tragic has happened. Our policy is to throw 50 more journalists at the problem. We're going to show it's not just you know, a sort of a self-righteous, you can never stop us, although that's part of it. It's also a strategic calculation. You know, people who kill journalists, it's not a crime of passion. It's a calculated, unfortunately, business decision, and we're going to change the calculus. So our policy, whenever a journalist is threatened or killed, we show that the story will not die. In fact, we're going to expose everything about you. And Jan, when he was killed, was collaborating with several of our partner member centers on stories about the Italian 'Ndrangheta mafia spreading into Slovakia.
I'm sure there are many here in the room who would love to hear more background about this. We will have time afterwards. Here we are running out of time a little bit at the moment, and I would like to give one more question over here. Okay, if you can make it briefly, both of you, because you were waiting for it so long time.
So, good afternoon. I'm Bestun from Iraqi Kurdistan region. You talked about Balkans, about East Europe, even about Latin America. But when you come to Middle East, the corruption is not done only by the governments. We have a bunch of non-state actors. We have ISIS smuggling oil. We have these militias that it is almost impossible for a journalist to do investigative journalism there. Yeah, you just find yourself killed in one day. So
what's your question then?
The question is what should be the right model to do investigative journalism in Middle East, in such a place where you're not safe at all?
Excellent. Thank you very much. And yours?
Hello, my name is Ashmal Jami. Good afternoon to all of you, and I'm from Pakistan. I'm a working journalist for a TV channel. Well, as far as this subject is concerned and your discussion is concerned, I'm more concerned about the role of international journalism bodies in order to provide support, all kind of support to those who are suffering from injustice, who are journalists doing some investigative stuff and under these threats by the government and top elite of their respective country, like developing countries like Pakistan. For instance, as my country fellow quoted about the Panama paper, you know, that was the story which ended up at ousting our Prime Minister and sending him back to home. And then the whole political landscape of Pakistan just got another shape. But those who are working stuff like you are doing and the stuff like mentioned in the subject of this program, at times they really need some international support, especially from the bodies who are representing journalists. Like a few years ago, a Greek journalist, Kostas Vexivenis, he did a story against some political elite in Greek, and then he was tried before the court. Ultimately, some international TV channels like Al Jazeera and some international journalist bodies, they stood behind him and provided him the due and required shelter.
What would be your question then?
So, in the developing country like Pakistan, those journalists who are working for this cause, unfortunately, being a journalist, I feel that they are unable to get the same support and same backing from the...
Your question would be how you could raise such support.
Yeah.
Right?
Why these bodies are not in action for those who are working in
Your question would be how to raise such support.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah? Okay, thank you very much. Who would like to answer that very last one?
More easy questions. As far as working in a, I guess they sort of address a similar issue. Working in an environment like that, you know, I don't know. I think our organization, to some extent, we show that it is possible to do journalism even in extremely dangerous environments. I mean, it's not Iraqi Kurdistan, but we have done very in-depth investigations in Tajikistan, which is one of the most closed countries in the world, in Azerbaijan also. And there are, I mean, I think that I can't, there's no strategy I can name right now that's going to be like, oh, that's the answer. But the answer, I think, that is it has to be possible. And they have to get support and recognition and from international organizations, not just some kind of intergovernmental bodies, but the Committee to Protect Journalists. I used to work at Freedom House, where I worked on the emergency assistance program, and we worked in Pakistan. We worked in maybe not Iraqi Kurdistan, but we worked in a lot of dangerous places, and we got emergency grants back then to journalists who needed help. So all I can say is, yes, it's a huge challenge. I don't think I have an answer, but I think that if it's possible elsewhere, it must be possible even in those places.
Maybe, Janine, it's a question of awareness, and that we are more aware of the need of journalists like that was just mentioned here in Pakistan, that there are people colleagues in need and journalists in need that need our support.
Well, it seems to me that in living memory, there's never been a greater need for investigative journalists than there is today. And I think we've seen so many important findings come out of the kinds of collaborations that ILIA is involved in, and the ICC, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, right? And that you put the data analysts together with the beat reporters, with the local people, anthropologists or historians who can help explain the context. I mean, these kinds of multidisciplinary collaborations can yield extremely important findings for society.
And just super quick, the collaborations are also another means of support. There were several journalists, Ecuadorian journalists, kidnapped and killed in Colombia last year when they were investigating some drug cartels, and they hadn't been working with us. That wasn't an environment we were in, but we did a whole project tracing their last journeys, finishing their investigation, and tracing what happened to them. And I think that we need to be in solidarity with our colleagues, no matter where they're from, and recognize that we all have one mission here, and let's all work together.
Thank you very much. What a nice word for the end. Thanks for being here, Janine.
Thank you so much.
Ilya, thank you very much. And thanks for your interest.